just at the corner, that we saw a real improvement. St Cuthbert's Boys Brigade Reunion. Happy Tollcross, Fountain Bridge men, all members of St Cuthbert's Boys Brigade, and celebrating that fact. Oh, we could name them all, but we must go on now, back on the trail. This short street takes up the route from Lothian Road. It was once called Wellington Street, and it became Earl Grey Street after 1832. Building society, now where Grant's large furniture store used to stand, and the popular XL bar known to so many. Now, 2 minutes and we're in central Tollcross. Fleming's store, Earl Grey Street. And we're looking back along Earl Grey Street. And once again, we're looking back in time. The popular Fleming's store was there, the central hall above it, and to the left here is West Tollcross, which led to the old tram depot, but now it leads to the new fire station. Everything in that hardware store, from a needle to an anchor. Now, this is central Tollcross, looking east. We're standing in Home Street, the centre. To the left there is Thornybock, wash house there once, but we're looking east again, east of the higher rigs there, and the foot of Lorison Place. It didn't always look like that. It was always, for long enough, pastoral countryside in the old days. 1780s. Just on the city's doorstep, a thriving agricultural economy during a period of great agricultural improvement, followed later, of course, by the industrial change that took place in this area, as well as everywhere else. Now, Tollcross Centre here, the early 20th century, and this is less than 150 years later. More change, trams now, but we still need horses. Soon will come the cable tram, and then the electric tram, then our excellent bus service. All in the name of progress. Talking of progress, Rygo Street in the Hungry 30s. Remember the barber shop? 2 church halls there, belonging to St Cuthbert's Free and the Greyfriars Free churches, dancing to a 3-piece band there on Friday and Saturday nights. A regular dancer there was the teenage James Bond, Sean Connery. The street was formerly called Dunbar Street, but after the Peninsular War, it was renamed Rygo Street after a distinguished Portuguese soldier. And talking of soldiers, 1939, a fight for love and glory, a case of do or die. And that's what these lads will be doing soon, for king and country. The usual brew queue here in Rygo Street has changed to recruitment queue. It's 1939, Britain's at war with Germany, and they'll soon be far from old Tollcross. Tollcross West. The Barclay Bruntsfield Church there, with its massive steeple and chancels on each side, built in 1860s by Frank Pilkington. And nearer to us, to the left, is just at the corner of Tarvett Street, the King's Theatre, opened in 1906 with pantomime, Cinderella. It was to bring many of the big names of stage and screen to Tollcross. Sarah Bernhardt to Ingrid Bergman, John Gielgud to Laurence Olivier, comedy stars from Harry Lauder to Stanley Baxter, international ballet and opera, it was all here. But what was here before? This is the site of the King's Theatre, Marshall's Fruit and Vegetable Market, once stocked from its own market garden there. The chimney at the back belongs to Taylor MacLeod Brewery, which caused the gentry living in this area to migrate about 1760s, because, as they said, the brewery lowered the tone of the area. Interestingly, when the King's was being renovated about 25 years ago, workmen discovered the original brewery well below the stage. And talking of gentry, to the left there, Darvett Street, which leads to Drumdrain Street, the site of Drumdrain House. There it is. It's long gone now, but once it was the town mansion of the Homerig family, who had property at Tarvett in Fife. Now this painting here looks east again. Tollcross, 1950s. Now more could be said and shown about Tollcross, but Fountain Bridge beckons us to bring it back into our story. Well, here's the intersection, but before we continue along West Fountain Bridge, across there, the long loading house building, once the old Inland Revenue building. And high up are pictorial plaques that remind us that once the buildings of the Hopetown port stood right there. And it was in the basin of the Union Canal, built in 1818 to 1822 as a branch of the Clyde and Forth Canal, was to bring industrial materials from the west prior to the railway age, but also coal to fuel the factories during the industrialisation of the city, especially Lord Hopetown's coal, hence Port Hopetown. Now we cross to continue Fountain Bridge and append on the other side, Hopetown Court. That's my colleague over there, George Brown. He's taken over now for the rest of the trail.
Thank you, John. Fountain Bridge is dead, and nobody came to the funeral. Here we are, through the Hopetown Pen. We can see the rear of Ponton House, and further down, the new medical centre. 50 years ago, Edinburgh Corporation tram depot stood here, until around 1959. In the 1790s, Gray's Brewery was here. Then it was taken over by the Haig family, who were relatives of the Grays. The Haigs converted the brewery into one of the first distilleries. They were the people who made drinking whisky respectable. Previously, whisky was illegal and regarded as rebellious and associated with the 45 Rebellion. For hundreds of years, the preferred drink of the Scottish people had been wine, but the new regime after the Union effectively closed that trade with France. After being betrayed by the Union, the initial anger of the population eventually gave way to despondency, providing a willing market for the purveyors of drink, especially cheap whisky. This was when the caricature of the drunk Scotsman originated. When people acquired the taste and whisky became popular, the producers became very wealthy people. Haig's Dimple is still one of the most popular drinks in the world. Here is a descendant of the Haig family, Douglas Haig, a man who was to affect every family in Britain. Like every good son of the Scottish ruling class, he was educated at Winchester and Bristol. He directed the major battles of the Great War, Ypres, Flanders and the Somme. Here was a man who could afford to lose 60,000 men on the first morning of the Battle of the Somme, 20,000 dead, 40,000 wounded, mostly Scotsmen. Haig's decisions on how many men were expendable affected every family in the land. He certainly affected my family. This is my grandfather, Private Edward Docherty, of the 1st Battalion Cameron Highlanders. He died on the 11th of November 1915 at Ypres, leaving behind a wife and 6 children who were left destitute. Multiply that predicament by untold thousands and we can get some idea of its impact on the general population. In hindsight, what baffles me is why all these volunteers hadn't read Lenin's pamphlet on an imperialist war. Maybe they could have got their priorities right. Here are the boys going over the top. We all know the reality of the trenches, we've all seen the films. 147,000 Scottish troops were dead by 1918. In our area, of the 550 men who volunteered from the rubber mill, 160 didn't come back. Incidentally, Haig died in bed of old age. We're now in Lochran. Here's the old washouse. Notice I didn't say steamy. It's only recently been demolished. This was a very important asset to the women of Tollcross and Fountain Bridge. Before washing machines were common, it was essential. Monday at the washes was a social event for local women. Gossip could be exchanged between neighbours and families, and help could be provided when needed. This is the only reminder of the slaughterhouse that was here until 1920s. It is part of the wall of the Tripery. This is Thornybock, which in Old Scots meant the bank of Blackthorn, along the banks of the Lochran Burn. Straight ahead is the back of the Cavendish. In the late 19th century, this was Mr. Blair's Riding Academy, a riding school for the well-off. There used to be a life-size equestrian statue on the roof. His house was on the front on Home Street. It's still there. Here is the band of the Cavendish on VE Day 1945. Not exactly Benny Goodman, is it?
You can see them wink the other eye at the man who broke the bank at Monte Carlo.
On the left, the Methodist Central Halls. Now we go back to Fountain Bridge, to the Clachan, the only remaining pub of the 6 there used to be in Fountain Bridge. This is Ponton House, now converted into flats. It was previously a boys' home for orphan boys of working age. The home had connections with local companies and could get the boys an apprenticeship. The boys I know liked their time there. This is the only reminder of the meat trade in Fountain Bridge. This wasn't a slaughterhouse, it was a cold meat store, and there were another 5. Further along we can see the encroaching financial sector buildings. At present, the plans on the table are that the remaining old buildings be demolished and replaced by glass and concrete office blocks, just like Glasgow's merchant city. As we are now in a service economy, the financial services sector will be successful. To them it is progress. What concerns us is that all traces of our history will be airbrushed out. Here's a rally of Anglia car owners in 1959, the early days of our love affair with the car. On the left is St Cudbert's funeral department, where Sean Connery worked as a coffin polisher. Further down is Alexander's garage. Alexander's acquired the franchise to sell Ford cars in Scotland around 1911. As an advertising stunt, the original Mr. Alexander drove a Model T Ford right to the top of Ben Nevis. In its heyday, Alexander's could produce a custom-built motorcar to the customer's specification. It employed around 200 tradesmen of all kinds. A driving licence was now a must-have. This is the same view at the turn of the 20th century. It is sometimes referred to as Slunk Street or just as Slunk. This was because of marshy ground, a quagmire on the right side of the street. A footbridge took the street over the canal. Notice Newport Street at the bottom of the street. Why Newport? Well, it was the main port for the canal, Port Hamilton. In the 1830s, there was a ticket office here. You could buy a ticket, steerage to Glasgow, for 4 and 6 pence, which is about 25 pence in today's money. This is Kirkwood's map of 1817. If we can concentrate on the top right of the picture, at the top you see Semple Street. This marks the eastern boundary of the ancient lands of Dalry. Roseburn marked the northern boundary, Gorgie Mill the western, and the Boroughmuir the south. The seat of power for these lands was Dalry House. It's still there. At the top you can see Jamaica Street, Tobago Street. This refers to the plantations of the West Indies. At this time, most wealth was derived from the slave trade, either directly from slavery or indirectly from tobacco, sugar or cotton. At the top is the property of a Mr. Morrison. Presumably he had involvement in the West Indies. Another thing to notice here is that the canal is a mere proposal at this date. It's not until after 1822 that its effects can be seen. The main thing to notice is that it's a rural scene. orchards and fields with crops. Here's the centre of power for the lands of the Rye. In 1661 the house was occupied by Walter Cheesley, a royal supporter of Charles II. The family arms can still be seen on the front. By the 1690s, due to the political upheavals, it was taken over by the Brand family, fanatical Covenanters. Here's Ponton Street. There were meat markets on both sides of the street. Older people will remember the market bar owned by the Allen family, with its antique circular bar and real coal fires. On the 1st November 1859, 12 tradesmen from the area registered a co-op and opened a shop. Having no money to pay for the registration, they sold copies of their rules at a penny each. They had 63 members in the first year, and by their 50th anniversary, they had 40,000. The store, as everybody called it, was to become the largest co-op in Britain. This is Smith's provision store. I can still recall the smells inside the store. Smoked ham and cheese, dried fish and coffee, all sold loose and wrapped in a paper bag. This wee shop employed an average of 15 staff. You could staff 2 supermarkets nowadays with that many. Now we're at Tollcross Primary School, now a bilingual school. Gaelic is a second language, and it's multicultural. Here are the war babies of 1953. I remember learning to write on a slate, the indoctrination, school dinners, the cold, and corporal punishment. Still, we got a good foundation in the 3 R's. Everybody could read and write by the age of 10. There was one lady teacher who persisted in telling us that the word for sweeties was sweets, but we all knew better. There was a sweetie factory just along the road. This is a class from when the school had only been open for 10 years or so. It's the 1920s. Here we are at Tollcross Community Centre, where I ran the art classes. In 1986, Sean and his wife paid a visit and bought one of my paintings. This is what was there before the school was built, the famous Egyptian gate, the entrance to Fountain Bridge Slaughterhouse. The classical gate was designed by Richard Crichton. Notice the formal dress of the gatemen. As usual, the gate was lost in the name of progress. Here we are inside the Cullen House. The place was closed in 1912 for fear of disease and vermin and moved to Gorgie. The janitor's house is all that remains. This view was taken from a balloon in 1912. You can see where we've been. Semple Street, the chimney at the tram depot. There's the slaughterhouse and the pally, which was an ice rink at this time. Notice the canal crossing the street. We're now looking at Scott Mid Offices, 92 Fountain Bridge, which is soon to be converted into a hotel. Here's the building in 1955, when it was blackened by a soot. The butcher shop was on the left, the baker's on the right. There's the old Fair Exchange pub, previously McLaren's. Before the telephone exchange was built, there was a fun fair across the road. A shot of the milk department of the store, with the inset of the carts taking off on their runs. Local boys can always get a job, delivering the store milk. Big Sean started off here. The loading bay of the milk department. Remember, St Cubberts were the largest farmers in Britain, as well as the largest retailers, so they produced their own milk. Here are the girls at 92 sorting out the divvy, sometime in the 1950s. Notice the number of girls employed. The store was probably the biggest employer in Scotland, if you include all its divisions. It was a good job for a girl in those days, and there were many perks. Divvy Day was a red letter day for local mothers. Maybe they could afford to buy the bairns a new pair of shoes for school. Every woman in Bairn could easily recite their store number. After all, we were all shareholders. Before the telephone exchange was built, a fun fair stood here, with all the usual attractions. Also, there was a Stewart's boxing booth. where you could win a fiver by just laying a glove on the resident fighter. Easy money. Chalmers Buildings, completed by 1853 as houses for workers. As a B-listed building, the planners have had to plan around the building, an unsatisfactory situation for everyone. The new office buildings will loom 4 or 5 stories above the roof level, and after office hours, the residents fear that will leave the streets deserted until the next morning. Life will have gone from Fountainbridge. The Mecca Pally Bingo. Once this was a marvellous place, a dance hall, an ice rink, a cinema. Here we have a group of revellers at a theatrical ball during the 1930s. You can see this is a posh do, penguin suits and formal dresses. Mr. Poole, who owned the Synod Halls and other cinemas in the town, can be seen on extreme left. The Coliseum Picture House was next door. For 20 years, the Fountainbridge Pally was the most profitable dance hall in Britain. Even Jimmy Savile was a resident DJ for a year. As about that then. Another building that's been swept away in the name of progress. This was the house of the gatekeeper of Lochran Basin, my family home for 20 years. The ground floor was my father's office. The public house is legendary. Here's the Over the Hill team. The new development properties overlooking the basin are selling for £500,000. Fountainbridge in Winter 1953 by me. The blue building in the centre was Bob Pearson's snooker hall, where the Valder boys used to congregate. At the back is Freer Street and the rubber mill. This is the billiard team of 1939. Soon they'll be swapping their cues for Lee Enfields. Here's the snooker hall at demolition. The wee shop in the middle was Mary Meikle's, then a haberdashery, then Pistoni's chip shop. You can see the gable end of Freer Street Terrace in the distance. We're behind the building in the previous picture, 137 Fountainbridge at the back. The boy is standing in the back green of number 7 Freer Street. Another tenement painting, number 7 Freer Street, with the typical turret stairwell. 30 families lived in this tenement. Here's what left of the Tartan Club. This was a workers' club for employees of S&M Brewery, when they used to be Scottish. A club big enough to attract stars such as Matt Monro. Great days. Some of you will be saying, what are we doing in Iona? Well, the connection is a real one. The man who founded the Iona community was the same man who ministered to the people of Freer Street in the Roaring Twenties. And here he is, George MacLeod. He served his time as a young minister in Freer Street during the Depression of the 1920s. From here he went to Govan, another disaster area. He dedicated his life to the poor wherever he went. He was to become Lord MacLeod of Funerary, a great socialist and a great internationalist. And here was his pulpit. Not very grand, is it? This was the centre of the community. All the women and children's clubs, Sunday school, day trips, all were organised from the hall. We even had real missionaries. They came from the USA and Canada to preach in deepest Fountainbridge. In complete contrast, here's Harold Wilson visiting Freer Street Terrace in the mid-60s. After a look at these houses, he told the press that these were the worst slums in Europe. Here are the ladies from the Ocean Hall on a Sunday drive to the country in the 1930s. The minister is Reverend Leonard Small, who took over the mantle of George MacLeod. He rose to become moderator of the General Assembly. The real heroines of the Depression. We held it all together when the going got tough. Remember, they were members of the biggest, richest empire the world has ever known. We always got the hole in the donut. You can see the pride in their poverty. This is a bird's eye view of Fountain Bridge in the 50s. The canal bottom right with Free Street Terrace, the telephone exchange in the centre, St Cudbert's beyond with the Pally opposite, an oil painting of course. The boys of 149 Fountain Bridge in 1919, just after the Great War, taken against the gable end of Azawaz's scrap merchants. Members of Fountain Bridge Reminiscence Group dedicating the chair in the memory of the people of Free Street. The plaque reads, "For the good times." A photograph of the street in 1952. Here is the staff of the Ethicon in the late 40s. Surgical suppliers, taken over by Johnson & Johnson and moved out to Sighthill in the 1990s. This was Harper's Dairy in Fountain Bridge in the 1930s. Her name was Margaret Pinkerton. The shop is here in this shot. This was taken just before demolition in 1968. Notice the sign for Azawaz's over the pend. Everybody's gone. In its heyday, Fountain Bridge boasted 6 pubs, 2 Italian chip shops, 3 bakers, 3 butchers, 3 grocers, 2 ice cream shops, many sweetie shops and 2 street bookies. I don't want to be accused of romanticising the old days. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Although wages were low and hours were long, there was practically full employment. Even the bairns had a job on the milk or delivering papers. There was an air of optimism. Things could only get better. The future was bright. Generally, the women supplied the discipline over the bairns and sometimes the husbands. The men left Saturday nights to settle the scores. The bad thing was the living conditions. Bringing up a large family in a room and kitchen with no bath or hot water. Everybody thought that a new house would be the answer to all their problems. Little did they know. An early aerial view again. At the centre you can see the pens. That's Azawaz's with the tower. This was the site of an old silk mill built in the 1830s with financial help from the corporation. It cost £40,000, a lot of money in those days, and it failed after 10 years. Notice the footbridge over the canal, Free Street Terraces where the canal bends. This is the back greens of the pens, Free Street in the distance. Here we have the staff of Mackay's Sweetie Works, a big employer of women, formerly called Marwick's. They made Highland toffee and boiled sweets. The mother of the boys in the picture, Mary Cruikshanks, was the leader of the campaign Save Our Washhouse in the 1970s. Fountain Bridge's answer to Lonnie Donegan, Me and My Pals in 1955. Notice the tenements behind, taken from Azawaz's pend. The following 4 scenes are my impression of the 4 seasons seen through one of the pens. Spring, summer, autumn, and winter. Behind the Grove Bar on a Friday night, a discussion in the pend. The corner of Grove Street. The corner building number 90 was built by Pilkington, who also built the Barclay Church. The building is made of various styles as an advert for Pilkington's schools. Next door was the Grove House, which provided cheap accommodation for working men. The Artisan on the ground floor was a cheap restaurant. Grove Street was named after an avenue of trees on Alexander Brand's land. The house was also named the Grove. St Cudbert's Stables was situated on the right-hand side of the street. When Roy Rogers, the screen cowboy, visited Edinburgh in the 1950s, he booked into the Calais Hotel, while Trigger had to make do with the store stables. To be safe, he brought 2 Triggers. Here is Grove Street Dispensary, one of a series throughout the town to cater for the poor, before the National Health Service was introduced.
Beautiful railway bridge of the Silvery Tay. Alas, I am very sorry to say,